Thank you, all of you guys, for coming out tonight. I know it's the premiere of Glee, so it's great to see you guys here. I actually literally stepped off a plane last night. I'm a little bit groggy still. Time zones and culture shock and lots of other things complicate my ability to be coherent. But the good thing is that I feel very much, looking at both the audience and the panel, like I'm surrounded by old friends. There's a lot that we've talked about, a lot that we've already discussed and expressed and explored, and yet there's so much more. One of the really nice things, actually, about where we're having this is that literally looking around us, this exhibit, this incredible sort of feat of many, many months of work has now become almost like the connective tissue that's sort of bringing together this entire APA Institute office complex. And that in some ways is the way that I reflect upon the milieu, the genre, the platform of the comic book today. We've gotten to a point now where comic books no longer have to struggle to be seen as mainstream. They no longer have to sort of pull themselves out of this primordial ooze of being this marginal fan category. But in many ways, they still haven't stepped into the position where they belong. And that position is not simply being part of the mass of media, but in many ways, a pioneering force, something that's pressing the envelope of what it means to communicate and connect. In other panels before, we've talked about how, especially given an era in which so much of our communication is about words and symbols together. If you think of the digital space, we live in an iconographic world, a world where icons, symbols stand in for much deeper and bigger and brighter things. Avatars now represent human beings. Snippets of text represent entire storylines. Our world is framed by a screen. And the window that we looked at the world through, the window of the computer, almost mirrors exactly the frames we use in graphic novel storytelling. And at the same time, we live in a global world, a world in which so much of who we're interacting with, I mean, having just come back from Africa, I can tell you, there are many people around the world who are literate in symbols, but maybe not in words, who are able to actually communicate and translate and connect via the use of images and text and speech together in ways they wouldn't be able to if it was just pure words alone. So in some ways, comics represent the future of communication, not just our past, not just our present. And I think the panel that we're going to be talking with later on today will show the many ways in which comics still have yet to press that envelope, to bring us into that future. But before all of that, of course, we have the main, in some ways, event. Certainly the main event for this coming season of APA Institute, and that is the arrival of Larry Hama as artist-in-residence here. I know he's already had, first of all, he needs no introduction, but he's already had an extensive one from Jack. But I wanted to add that so much of what, when we talk about connective tissue, comic books being that sort of way of bringing together worlds, is represented in his career as somebody who has literally been such a Renaissance man, stretched across so many different genres of creativity and achievement. He represents that with his life and with his work, being able to actually connect not just his activism, his ideals, his sense of self, with the kinds of things that he's actually creating artistically. That's something which I think is aspirational for all of us, whether we're creators or not. And so without any further ado, I'd like to bring up Larry Hama, the man of the day, to say a few words about what he's going to be doing.
Thank you, Jeff. Change. I mean, when I first became an editor at DC Comics in 1977, I looked at what the product was, and I noticed that Asians in the comics were still being colored yellow, solid yellow, and so I went into the production department and I talked to the production manager, Jack Adler, and I didn't storm in there and say, hey, why are you doing this, or voice an objection like that. I just asked him, oh, why are we still doing this? And he said, it's because we've always done it. And I said, well, maybe we shouldn't do it anymore. And that's all it took. It doesn't take a lot of change isn't from overt action. It's just getting your foot in the door and being there and being yourself and being in there. And I think that's what it's about. And this the mediums that I've worked in, comics are very different now than when I started, and that's a good thing. Change is good. Stagnation is death. Everything has to evolve, and I think comics are still evolving, and that's good. And we have to embrace that change. When I first started at Marvel Comics, the bullpen was full of the guys at drawing tables with big pots of rubber cement. And they would just paste, everything was like pieces of paper and photostats and things pasted together. And when all that started to change, the letterers and other people would say, well, it's not going to change. We're always going to have lettering, and we're always going to be coloring on silver prints. And I said, no, it's going to change, and we have to embrace all that. And one letterer I knew, I told her, look, go out and get yourself a Mac and create a font, because this lettering on the paper isn't going to be here soon. And, you can't resist it. And, resisting it is death, and we have to just keep on going. And that's one of the things that I want to deal with, as a project here, is to be able to create some sort of anthology web comic that's sort of a gateway, and something that's interactive, that people can participate in as well as just look at, and something you could listen to too. It's all involved, and it's all one, and we just have to go with it. I can't be more specific about that because I'm sort of making it up as I go. Like I'm making this up as I go. But, that's the other factor, is that, you just, at every key point in my life, I've always had that impulse to just tuck my head down and run, because boy, this is too frightening. This is too hard. This is too whatever. And every time I've resisted that impulse, something good has happened. Because when you resist that impulse, you're just letting yourself slide back into into the world of the predictable. And when you take that step and go, oh, well, I've never done this before, in 1976, I got cast in a Broadway show. Never acted before. I don't sing or dance. I got a phone call at the office I was working in, and they said, oh, somebody recommended you. Why don't you come in and audition? And I said, I don't sing or dance. This is a musical, right? And they said, well, yes, but we really want to see you. And I said, but I don't sing or dance. And they said, well, you know, the number we just called you at is the same prefix as our number. Where are you? And I said, I'm on 48th Street and Fifth Avenue. They said, well, we're at 49th Street and Fifth Avenue. We're a block away. If you walk over right now, we'll see you. You know? And I said, well, why should I do this? You know, but I went. And they said, well, come, you know, they really liked the way I looked. They wanted me to come in the next day and do a song. You know, at the theater. And so I show up the next day, and I didn't have sheet music, so I brought my own guitar and a pig nose amp. And there were like 3 guys in front of me, and one guy got up and did The Impossible Dream. And the second guy did Try to Remember the Kind of September. And you know, the third guy did something from Camelot. And I got up and I did the first verse of Bob Dylan's Just Like a Woman, because I knew the guitar part. And they stopped me after one verse, and Stephen Sondheim said, well, can you do one more verse, and this time don't imitate Dylan? And I said, I'm not imitating Dylan. This is the way I sing. And he said, well, can you read music? And I said, well, I could sight read for E-flat alto saxophone. And I went home, and the next morning they called me up and said, well, you know, come in and sign a contract. You know, the rehearsals start on Monday. And so I went through an entire weekend of utter panic, thinking, how the heck am I going to do this? You know? But I showed up on Monday, and they put the show on its feet right away. And the choreographer, you know, stood in front of us, and she pointed to me and these 2 other guys. And the 2 other guys are acrobatic dancers, professionals. And she said, okay, you know, when you 3 guys are the same height, so that's why I'm clumping you together. And when the curtain goes up, only you 3 will be on stage. So you got to really hold the whole thing together for the first 60 minutes, right, for the first 60 seconds. And I turned to these 2 other guys and I said, I'm not a dancer, you know. I don't want to do this. And they said, I'll never forget this. This one guy turned to me and said, don't worry about it. Just do what we do. And I did. And you know, that's when I figured out that, you know, there's a lot of what we do, you know, and a lot of what we go through in life that we're just faking it, you know. And if nobody ever did that, we wouldn't get anywhere, you know. That's what it's about, and that's, you know, basically my rationale for my project here is, like I said, I'm making this up on the spot, but this is what I've always done. You know, when I get up and play with you know, play guitar or sing with the band, I have no idea what the solo is going to be. You know, like lots of people have all this stuff nailed down, and like, I just have no idea, you know. And I'm frightened as hell until the first note, and then I'm okay, you know. And I feel the same way about drawing or writing. It takes me days sometimes to sit down and write one sentence because I'm sure that it's going to suck. But once I get rolling, I'm okay. And that's been my philosophy, and it's worked for me. I don't know if it works for anybody else. but That's it. Jeff, you want to start the panel?
So, life lessons from Larry Hama. Deep thoughts. No, but it's true, and I think that actually, the first time I was exposed to Larry's life philosophy and creative philosophy was when we actually, I think, did a panel quite a few years ago now at the old home of the Museum of Chinese in the Americas, and I remember asking him. He was in the middle of doing a limited series on, I think it was snake eyes and well, in any case, he was doing a series of, shorter works extending the legend of the Joes, and I remember reading the first couple ones because he had them there and being really sort of breathless about what was going to happen next, and I asked him, so, I mean, I hate to ask for spoilers. What's going to happen next? I don't know. He's like, he doesn't figure it out until he actually is writing it. And the characters tell him what they're doing. They essentially have a life of their own. And I think that's actually a pretty good prescription for the way that this particular art form works. If you look at comics, comics are perhaps the only major medium in which you have many, many combinations over many decades of individuals working on common characters, on individuals, on creations that have a life of their own. The people who invented, who innovated, who generated the stories and the icons and the heroes that we know and love today are long since gone. But those stories keep on going, and they keep on getting reinvented. And every time you open a page, organically, you're seeing a new chapter, maybe even a new beginning to those heroes' lives. And I think that, in some ways, is part of what makes comics such an interesting force in the world today. And this panel is going to explore some of that. The title of it was Beyond the Funny Pages. We're going to look at how comic books have transcended, in many ways, the conventional artifacts and parameters that we have been used to thinking of. Comic books have, again, long since been seen as, at least since the 80s and onwards, a kind of a very marginal force, a small percentage, very mostly male, and of a certain age and of a certain social outlook, were seen as the individuals who were most associated with comic book fandom and comic book reading. But there was a history before that in which comic books were a mainstream media in America. 50% of all Americans at one point read comic books regularly. Elsewhere outside the United States, especially in East Asia, comic books are not just a mainstream medium, they are a platform. They're a way in which information is communicated across a whole range of different subject matters and for different audiences. And now increasingly, here in the US, we're starting to see some of those innovations come home. Innovations in the platforms that are deployed in, the audiences they're targeted at, the kinds of stories being told, and the uses to which comics are being put. And so the panelists we have today, beginning with, of course, Larry, are going to share some of the ways in which they've seen some of that evolution happening in their work, in their lives, and hopefully in our society. So I'll do a really brief introduction, but I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves, how they got into comics, and about a work or project or something they've been involved in that really reflects that sort of larger theme of this panel. So to Larry's right, and your left, we have Christine Norrie. Christine is an artist and writer of graphic novels and comic books, of course. Her first major work, Hopeless Savages, was an indie hit with the first series nominated for an Eisner, which is kind of the deal in comics. Other noted books she's worked on are the original graphic novel Cheat, the teen drama Breaking Up, and she's been published by a full range of major and independent companies, including DC, Oni Press, and Scholastic. And she's also done a lot of work as an illustrator and designer beyond the comic medium in fashion, advertising, print, etc. It's Christine Norrie.
Hello. Speaking on the themes that you were talking about, it's funny, we went to Le Pont Quotidien for an after-school snack today, and they have a new comic there
Oh, really?
about the origins of making bread in Brussels and how they founded it. And actually, there's going to be a second issue out soon, apparently. So if you go and you want nice coffee and bread and comics in a very unexpected place, that's where you'll find it, which is, I got into comics in the early 90s, like 89, 90. I was a teenager, high school, got into a crowd of kids who were really into comic books and fell in love because I liked books and I liked art. And all of a sudden I was like, wow, I've never seen this stuff before. I love it. And I was gobbling, long boxes of comic books and lurking at the comic book shop. And then became a comics retailer, worked at DC Comics for a while until I started out and making my own work. And because of that route, I feel like I wasn't indoctrinated as a younger person. I think most women that I'd known at the time were into comics from their brothers or their dads, but I kind of came into it later in the game, maybe. But because of my interest and because of the way the industry was then, I did some comics and then went out and did other things, and finding unexpected places to bring comics to, like the fashion world or magazine illustrations where they kind of knew of my work. But they would want me to present it in a comic book style. So I feel like I've been able to kind of reach a different audience than I thought. I thought I would be drawing X-Men comics or something. But I found I really, really love, I love the superhero stuff, but I really love bringing comics to places that people normally don't see them.
That's great. To Chris's right, we have Greg Pak. Award-winning comic book writer and illustrator, best known for the feature film Robot Stories. Are you really best known for that these days? You're best known for everything. As well as comic storylines such as Planet Hulk, Incredible Hercules, co-written with Fred Van Lent, and co-starring Pak's creation Amadeus Cho, favorite of mine. He is named one of the 25 filmmakers to watch by Filmmaker magazine, described as a talent with a future. That's always good, by the New York Times, and named Breakout Talent of the Year by Wizard Magazine. And he's currently writing Alpha Flight, Astonishing X-Men for Marvel, and Dead Man's Run for Aspen, as well as Gail Ann Hurd's Valhalla. Greg Pak.
Great. Thanks a ton. I grew up reading comics when I was a kid. My mom would give us kids, she gave us crayons and paper. She didn't believe in coloring books, so we were drawing as kids. I was home not so long ago and found a comic book I drew when I was, I think, 5 years old, and she had written the captions for me. It was about a dragon that turned electric. It was really awesome, but it only had one act, because that's basically what happened. It turns electric. So someday maybe I'll go back and finish that. So I grew up drawing. I was a cartoonist in high school and college, but at the same time I was studying. I'd written short stories since I was a kid, and also did theater. So I was kind of obsessed with storytelling in general. But at a certain point, I didn't let myself think about doing that professionally for whatever reason. I was very interested in politics. I studied political science, went back home to Texas and worked for Ann Richards when she was running for governor back in the day, and thought I was going to go into politics. But I had the chance to go to Oxford to study history, and in a very convoluted way ended up getting involved with a student film group and went to film school at NYU and became a filmmaker. And then after my feature film Robot Stories came out, my agent found out that Marvel was looking for writers. And said, hey, would you be interested? And I was like, would I be interested? Yes. And I got to have some meetings with folks at Marvel, and ended up developing some stories, and about a year later was writing comics for Marvel. So in a very kind of unexpected and convoluted way, this sort of initial love for drawing and comics has, I've managed to circle around and end up writing comics. So I've been doing it for, I think, 7 years now, which is kind of amazing to me when I look back. But in terms of like, if the panel is about pushing boundaries or where comics is going, I mean, some of the things that I guess there are two big things that I've done that I think are maybe interesting or worth talking about. I mean, I'm always uncomfortable saying that anything I'm doing is anything because that's not really up for me to say. You know what I'm saying? It's presumptuous for me to say, oh yes, it's very significant because of this. That's up to readers to decide. But something I've tried to do, and this was throughout my film work and everything else, was I've always been interested in getting different people up on the screen or on the page. I did a lot of films with Asian American characters, and in comics I've sort of been very happy to jump on opportunities to tell stories with diverse casts. I mean, creating Amadeus Cho was a blast in comics, and just about every project I've worked on has had some kind of interesting diversity to it. I wrote a War Machine series starring Jim Rhodes, who is the great African-American superhero at Marvel. I did a Magneto Testament miniseries, which is the origin story of Magneto, who was in the stories is a German Jewish kid growing up trying to save his family during the rise of the Nazis and the Final Solution. And the kind of amazing thing about comics has been, or specifically about Marvel, has been that, and this goes back to what Larry said. It's like, you don't have to make a big fuss, but once you're in, you can do things. I mean, I had this opportunity to create a character. I was challenged. A number of writers were challenged to create new characters based on old names that Marvel owned, and I picked out the name Mastermind Excello and created Amadeus Cho, who's this, incorrigible super genius in the Marvel universe. And at no point during the entire process did anybody say, does he have to be Korean? They just got it, and they went, and it never came up. I just got to do it, and if not me, then who? You know what I mean? Like once you have the opportunity, why not go for it? And stuff can happen. And I've found that that kind of thing has happened again and again and again. So so there's that. And then the other sort of interesting thing I think is, we'll see if the panel goes that way, but I think the digital comics is an interesting challenge right now to the comics industry. And I mean, I worked on a book. I wrote a book called Vision Machine, which actually we're giving out for free here. It was funded by the Ford Foundation. It's a sci-fi story that imagines the world 50 years from now with a special emphasis on changing technology and the effect of that on media making and on trademark copyright and surveillance and privacy. It's really just a crazy sci-fi story. But the book was initially released digitally, and now we've got print copies that you can walk away with. But that's given me the chance to kind of explore with what's going on in the digital world in terms of digital distribution of comics, and also the new if there are new creative aesthetic opportunities for comics once you move it into a digital realm. So those are some interesting topics that might be interesting to look at.
Polymath, Greg Pak. Seriously, Greg is one of those individuals who, even if you don't know he's there, in Asian American kind of mass popular culture, he's there. He's done everything. He is everywhere. Truly somebody who I
don't sing or dance, though.
He's the watcher. Anyway, but one of the things that Greg mentioned, and of course Larry did as well, which I think is really critical, is this larger idea that comics can be used not just as a means of communication, but as a force for social change, for actually moving the needle on the culture, both by telling stories, by representing different conditions, different ways, different histories that might not be depicted in any other fashion. We cannot do necessarily a $90 million documentary about every facet of Asian American history and the context in which each of us individually have grown up, both in today's era and in the many decades and centuries that have preceded us. But the comics allows us to do that. The comics allows us to throw it all up on the screen, literally. You can, I think, in fact, Greg has said this to me before. One of the real attractions of the comics is that if you want to do a $100 million blockbuster with, special effects, time travel, whatever the hell you want, in the comics you can do it. indie filmmaking, not quite so easy. The two last panelists that we have here with us, last and certainly not least, are individuals who have actually taken the lens of the comics and turned it on social conditions, on our identity, our history, our culture. Toyoshima is the creator-illustrator of Secret Asian Man, for those of you guys who have followed his work over the years. Since 1999, Tak has been creating strips that examine race, politics, religion, Star Wars nerds, and anything else that gets people's undies in a bunch. In 2007, Secret Asian Man actually became the first nationally syndicated comic strip featuring an Asian American lead character when it was signed by United Features. And we're very lucky to have Tak with us today.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Tak. You know, like everybody here, pretty much grew up, you know, as a kid reading comics. I was mostly a Marvel kid. But, you know, mixed with that, I'm Japanese American. My parents would actually buy Japanese comics also and just kind of have them around. And, you know, I think it was their subtle way of making me learn Japanese. And, you know, because I couldn't read them otherwise. So it was like Doraemon, Dr. Slump, like kind of these classic, these books. And, you know, so it was an interesting mix kind of growing up, thinking back. I didn't really think actively, you know, this is the Japanese comics, this is the Marvel comics. They were just comics. They were just stories. They were cool pictures. So, you know, I did that. My first comic I ever drew was with my brother. It was a remake of a Robocon. I don't know if you guys know Robocon. It's a Japanese, like a kind of a Power Rangers-y looking thing, but a lot campier. Kind of like Yo Gabba Gabba, actually. And, you know, we did this thing. We did the cover, you know, summer of '76 or whatever it was. So, you know, always drew. Dad's an artist, so, you know, very supportive in that way. He let us draw on the walls, which is great. And he's even saved a little patch on the wall. And, but, you know, went to school and didn't really think of it as a career. Just kind of, you know, like, well, my dad's an artist. I can, you know, that's a tough life. Gallery artist, you know, it's not the easiest thing in the world. So I started kind of pursuing a life in advertising in Boston, where I still live. And, but towards the end of it, I started realizing I still loved comics. I still kept reading comics. And right around the late 80s, early 90s, there was this weird thing was happening in comics. There was this tremendous boom in independent comics. And that's where a lot of the, you know, a lot of the Image comics, a lot of these kind of very, you know, like Spawn and kind of hyper action comics came from. And suddenly everybody was producing their own comics, and I wanted to be one of those people producing their own comics. But, you know, I knew it was a tough thing. I saw the lines at the convention with the kids at the portfolios just standing there and, you know, just getting turned away by editors. And, you know, but I tried to put together a little, you know, stapled together zine-style thing, sold it at the local comic shop for $2. You know, got $1 for every sale. And I'd come in on Wednesday and be like, $3. You know, like I'd turn it around and buy some more comics with it. But it was great. It was being involved. It was, you know, just kind of in the game. And of course, the dream was to work on a Hulk, work on a, you know, an X-Men or a Wolverine or whatever it was, because that's what everybody wanted to do. So I worked on that, but along the way, you know, a funny thing happened. And while the store that had the comics for sale happened to also be a publisher for a comic called The Tick, which was, you know, if you guys know, it's a big blue, kind of goofy, you know, kind of a parody type comic, but it was genius and it was great, and I loved reading it. But, you know, at that point they had ceased the original run of them, but turns out they were bringing it back. And so the publisher called all the stores and said, hey, you know, you guys know any customers who come in and draw and, you know, kind of you see stuff all the time. They said, oh yeah, there's this guy Tak, you know, check out his stuff. And, you know, that Saturday I got a call from the publisher at home. And, you know, I'll never forget. And it was just kind of like, hey, you know, this is George Suarez, you know, you want to work on The Tick? I was like, what are you talking about? And, you know, so then from there, I started working on the Tick comics for about 5 years. And, you know, suddenly I was still working as a preschool teacher, didn't go into advertising. I was a preschool teacher with long hair and a mohawk. And, you know, and meanwhile, nighttime, I'd come home, you know, with crayons in my hair, and I'd start working on the Tick pages. And, you know, I was like living this kind of lifestyle, and it was great. And I started going to conventions, being on this side of the table instead of the other side of the table, and, you know, people lining up and have a little name card, and it was great for the ego. And because I was also working for an established character, which had a, you know, tremendous fan base, very cult-like fan base, you know, people would come up to me with weird requests like, hey, can you sign my toy? And, I didn't work on your toys. Or he's like, no, that's cool, just right on the chest. And I was like, all right. So I'm like ruining toys. And, but then I started realizing, you do enough of those and it feels great, but I kind of realized that they weren't necessarily lining up for me. They were lining up for this character to be kind of part of this tick, culture. And so the whole time I'm thinking like, okay, well, I got a little bit, experience here, and I can draw real fast now. What can I do? And right around that time, I met this guy who was starting a magazine in Boston, and very, arts, poetry, fiction, photography kind of thing. You pick up for free at a restaurant kind of thing, at a bar. And I said, you want to do a couple of pages of comics in it every month? And I was like, well, okay, sure. It's 2 pages. I was like, well, what am I going to write about? And that's kind of when the idea of Secret Asian Man came up, because at that point, I was looking around at, what was in the mainstream culture, and I wasn't happy with what I was seeing. And, if I saw any Asian, specifically male faces at all, I kind of wanted to throw one more out there. And so I said, well, I'll do this. And, it's a zine. It's, a few thousand dropped off at a bar. Who's going to read this? To me, it was just kind of an exercise. And, just did that for a few years, and, suddenly emails would come, hey, your strip sucks, or, hey, this is a great strip. And so, you kind of, hyper react to one email, and, like, people love it, people hate it, and you just kind of go bananas over it. And so I just kept doing it, and for the longest time, it was just heads down, produce. Don't necessarily pay attention or, change it to what people think it should be. And eventually became weekly, and then, picked up the pace a little bit. I started getting better at it, started getting more picky about things. At first, it was very personal, like diary, pretty much stuff. Like, I went to Japanese camp, literal stories about things that happened to me growing up, Japanese in Chinatown, a lot of stories there. I went to PS 130 down the street, and, like Chinese gangs and all this stuff. And just this was a way for me to get all this stuff on, off my shoulders and see if I was able to communicate these stories effectively, just, kind of looking at it. And, so that's what it was, really. And then, 6 years in or something like that, out of the blue, this guy, Ted Rawl, calls and says he's kind of the rock star signer of all the new syndicate people. And he kept complaining for years to the syndicates, like, Sunday comics, daily comics, they're all dry, they're boring. You can read the whole thing without even smiling, because they're not, they're just space fillers. And, you guys need fresh blood. You guys need, a controversy. So they said, okay, well, shut up. Here's a job. You find me these people. You bring them to us, and we'll see what happens. And so, he called me up, and, another phone call I'll never forget was just, hey, you want to go daily? I was like, well, what do you mean? For who? And he's like, well, United Features, the guys who do Snoopy. And I was like, I just write about, like, Japanese camp. Like, what are people going to, think of this strip? And he's like, no, like, trust me, like, you're going to be great. And so, it was terrifying. It's kind of like Larry was talking about, like, here's this thing, this huge cliff, the amount of work, plus I had a full-time job. So it was just one of those things, I had to really think about. But obviously, I just couldn't say no to. So I said, okay, let's do it. Signed it up, developed it for a few months. Visited the offices, which is weird. Doors open, these big, 10 by 10 foot oil paintings by Charles Schultz, and it's the house that Snoopy built, and it's it's pretty intimidating. Big, huge table of sales guys just sitting there, like, discussing how they will sell the strip, and how will this do overseas, and it was really weird. And meantime, still trying to remember, this is what's important right here. Like, if this isn't good, everybody's going to know. It doesn't matter. So, did that, and, that was probably the biggest challenge, was kind of a change in tone. Because if you guys, I don't know, if anybody's familiar with the earlier stuff, it's a little more venomous, a lot of F-bombs and, all sorts of racial slurs and, very honest kind of, I don't care if my mom reads this, I know I'm going to get yelled at later, but I'm just going to do it. Became, now I'm writing strips for, kind of like middle America, soccer mom kind of crowd. But then that became the challenge of, it's not about, if all I did was write about being Japanese in Chinatown or Asian American, Asian Americans get tired of reading that after a while. So you really have to broaden it out. And that's when I realized, we all belong to many different groups, and all these different groups have very similar dynamics when they start clashing with each other. Religion, race, sexual orientation, whatever it is. And so that became the rod that I, kind of just, focused on. And, and was pretty well accepted. The work got a little bit overwhelming, so I decided to stop doing the daily just because I had a second kid on the way. Still had a full-time job, but I'm still doing a weekly, still online. So I'm definitely learning the ups and downs of internet, web type comic publishing, which nobody's really figured out yet, not even the syndicates. And a few people are making $1 million, like Penny Arcade guys and people like that, but having a little strip called Secret Age Man is kind of a tough sell for a lot of different places. And I don't know, at some point, in some ways, I'm kind of reverting back to the, you know what, I don't really care about what people think. I'm just going to do what I want and, just keep on going. So that's where I'm at now.
I still want the Secret Agent Man lunchbox, though.
It's a bento box. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, well, this is the future right here. So, last but definitely not least, we have GB Tran, and I actually met him before he began this epic work, which has since become this incredible graphic novel called Vietnam America, and he's from Brooklyn, the 718, represent, right? Cartoonist, illustrator, whose graphic memoir, Vietnam America, details his family's journey of survival through the Vietnam War and the refugee migration to the United States. It's been featured on ABC's World News Now. It was labeled one of Kirkus's. Kirkus Reviews is, kind of one of the benchmark review publications for books and publishing. One of the 12 can't-miss graphic novels of 2011, and it was one of Amazon's top 25 adult summer reads. And Library Journal called it engaging, challenging, disturbing. Trans family memoir belongs in all public and academic libraries. So recently that has also earned him a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Nonfiction Literature, and his work can be found online at gbtran.com. GB.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for showing up tonight. So the crash course about how I came to comics is exactly the same story about everybody else's. I grew up on them. Basically, I was introduced to them when my brother was kind enough to let me read his X-Men's and Transformers that he brought home from the neighborhood grocery store, only if I was, if he decided not to spend the afternoon beating me up or something. Decided to just let me read his comics to get out of his hair. So that's how I started, and so I started drawing comics at a very early age, like 6 or 7, and sadly, actually, with the exception of Vietnam America, which just came out this year, up to that point, the longest work that I'd ever done was still a comic that I drew when I was 10 years old called X Out, which was just basically robots battling each other with little human pilots inside. So every kid's story, right? So they've basically been part of my life, my entire life. They've entertained me and educated and enriched me for all 35 years, more or less. So when I grew up, I went to college. I was still reading comics, being the Marvel DC kid, but just because of the messages that I was getting from my parents and the community around me, I had to choose something much more sensible as a career. So I went to college for astrophysics, much more sensible than comics. And so throughout college, I was studying astrophysics, and in my off times during the summers, I was going to conventions, much like what Tack was describing, standing in portfolio review lines, hoping someone would look at my work, and just getting massive amount of rejection, just like Tack. So I feel your pain, man, when you're telling me this. Just feeling it inside. So I stuck with astrophysics for several years through college, and then I realized that despite the rejection and despite the objections of my parents, that I really did want to pursue comics and art. So I dropped that about 2 classes away from getting my degree, which my parents weren't too thrilled about, to just completely focus on art. And so fast forward a couple years later, I graduated from college. It was at the University of Arizona. And I graduated from U of A and then relocated to New York, to Brooklyn, New York, because I really didn't know what I was going to do with an art degree now. And I figured New York was a pretty good place to start trying to figure it out. And when I came to New York was when I actually started really expanding the comics I was reading and being exposed to. So no longer was I this Marvel, DC, Image guy, but suddenly being introduced to Pantheon and Fantagraphics and Top Shelf and all these, and of course bande dessinée, like European comics and manga and stuff like that. And that's just like, it was just like, and being in New York too was like another extra. So, so during those few years, when I came to New York, it also coincided with my first trip back to Vietnam, which was 2001. And correction there, it was my first trip to Vietnam. The back is in quotes, because I don't know if you guys ever get this thing where if your parents are like, when you're raised, they say, you really need to go to your homeland and see where you came from. And then it's suddenly, oh yes, I need to go back, even though I've never been before. So I went back, quote unquote, the first time in 2001, which was a couple months after I moved to New York, and it was a really eye-opening experience because I got to observe my parents in situations that were completely foreign to me, having grown up in the United States, because suddenly they were with family and friends that they had abandoned, and a part of their personalities came out that, the people they were when they were with these people, with these loved ones before they had to flee the country. So during that trip, it was 2 months, and I just kind of sat in the corner listening and eavesdropping while my parents had conversations with, the brothers and sisters they left behind, or the friends that they left behind, and their parents, my grandparents that they left behind, and just hearing like little random snippets of stories about their crazy life that I'd never heard of before. So after that trip and coming back, over the next few years, trying to set my footing in New York as an illustrator, as a freelance commercial illustrator, I would occasionally ask my parents questions about the stories that I heard in Vietnam, and invariably always their response was, well, I don't want to talk about that, or that's none of your business, or why are you asking me that question? So that happened for several years, and it wasn't until 2007 where I had the opportunity to really do a substantial story in comics. Basically, I always had on the back burner to do Vietnam America. That was always part of my mind, but just kind of getting to speed in New York and trying to get settled and stable, it was never really something I could invest a lot of energy into. Until an opportunity, I met with someone, a literary agent at the time, and he basically sat me down over tea and he said, look, if you could only tell one more story in your life, what would it be? And suddenly, like all these smaller stories that I was working on at the time, because I was a self-publisher, I was doing the zine stuff, like Tak was saying, going to conventions and doing all that stuff. But once posed with that question, I immediately went back to the Vietnam trip that I did in 2001, and I realized that I really wanted to get that history down to basically preserve it before it was too late. So I decided to go back in 2007 purely as a research trip to Vietnam, and spent a month traveling the entire country interviewing family and friends. And that was kind of my gateway to, when I came back, interviewing my parents more, because suddenly they saw in this child that previously till then was completely, uninterested in his roots, more or less, growing up, suddenly being very nosy and asking questions and learning a lot of things that they realized that they couldn't keep secret anymore. So they started talking to me, and ultimately it, fast forward 3 years later, where I worked on Vietnam America full time, which is the best 3 years of my life to this day. Fast forward to now, and the book just came out, and my parents are actually pretty happy about it, I guess. I don't know if you can say that. But to refer back to what Jeff was saying about how pushing the boundaries, I think for me with Vietnam America, it was more accurate to say that I really wanted this to more expand the boundaries, to expand the audience for comics and graphic novels and etc. Because I feel like for me, I wanted to. Although the story is very specific, it's about one Vietnamese family basically trying to survive a war and what happens because of the repercussions of it and reselling in the States. I mean, it's a very specific story, but for me, I felt that the story tackled very universal themes as far as like conflict, immigration, and like family legacy that I felt could resonate with a larger audience. And for me, as far as pushing or / expanding the boundaries of comics means growing the audience and trying to reach them with those kind of stories but also presenting it in a way that really takes advantage of the comics medium's unique storytelling capabilities. So that's it in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. Terrific. I haven't really introduced myself. I mean, there's a little paragraph you can read here, but my main and only real claim to connection to the comics is that I edited an anthology of Asian American superhero comics called Secret Identities. And one of the things that really prompted us to do Secret Identities was this recognition that there was sort of a unique relationship in some ways between being Asian American, and the comics. Many of us, I think, as alluded to by Tak and others, learned English or learned our ancestral tongue via comics. I remember when I was a kid only speaking Taiwanese and learning English really by reading comics. And then when I forgot all my Chinese, learning Chinese by reading comics, such as I can still read it very little. And at the same time, there's something really kind of uniquely, almost anthropologically connective around comics and East Asian cultures in particular. And that's because the languages, the written language, which pervasively has shaped the civilizations of East Asia, and in many ways Southeast Asia as well, is one that is based in pictograms, in words that really are pictures. If you look at a Chinese character, what it really is kind of a rebus of different smaller images that stand in now as icons for meaning. These aren't alphabets. These are literally characters made up of smaller pictures that together create semantic meaning. And that means that there is perhaps some kind of innate, if you will, maybe sociological openness to telling stories through pictures that are words or pictures with words. So I'm going to throw that out first. This idea that maybe there is some sort of unique relationship or unique resonance, perhaps, that comics have with being Asian American. And I'm going to toss it open to Larry first, because it was actually Larry's root insight that led to this panel, of course, in first talking about this, and this larger idea that perhaps there is something meaningful about the cultures we spring from or are rooted in, and the way that they've embraced or express themselves through this medium.
Well, basically, I believe that the whole process of the way humans can create and recognize two-dimensional representations of our real world is hot-wired into us. That's why we can look at paintings on cave walls. They're 20, 30,000 years old. And we know that we can recognize what those things are. And we know what's going on. And we can follow the progression of the events. And, when you think about it, breaking down what we see through our eyes in the three-dimensional world into these two-dimensional symbols and representations, and to make that recognizable to any other human on the earth, that's pretty amazing. And that has to be hot-wired. That's not something that we learn how to do. We see this immediately. And so I don't think it's cultural. It's a human thing. And it's also, I think it's very telling that, I believe the first people, the term artist is very strange. And I think it's very modern. I think the people that drew those things on cave walls, didn't have the job description of artist in their community. They were magicians. Because that stuff was magic. And it all had to do with mystical stuff and mystical connections. And those paintings are in places that are very difficult to get to. And that's why they've survived. But human beings have always been able to do this. I think this is the You know, it may be weird, but the whole concept of being able to look at progressions of pictures and get something out of it is something that only we can do. And if we're conscious of this, you know, we can be in control of how these perceptions and these methodologies to create this stuff evolves. And you know, right now we're at the cusp of this really terrific evolution on how all this stuff is created and disseminated. And you know, we have to really be open about it, I think.
I think that was really beautiful, Larry. The first thing I thought of, for some reason, was being on an airplane this summer and looking at the little pictorial thing about how to escape the plane. And somehow my daughter and I are looking at this, and we make up this whole story. You know, there's like a baby in a life vest, and we're like, look, he's floating in the ocean because he's a super baby, you know? Or like there's the one guy, like there's the guy who's not supposed to do stuff, and he's like a silhouette, and he's like looking at things. We're like, he's got lasers, he's putting fire on the plane. And I think it, like, for the modern person, we're, you know, from beautiful ancient reading walls to now just being bombarded with images that are made specifically for us. Like, everything is now curated for us. You can choose whatever you want, and we immediately put ourselves in that story, and we have this huge ego, and we create these fantasies for ourselves, and everybody's doing it. And you know, I feel like these days you don't have to necessarily be a prophet or a magician. You just have to be alive and have the internet, and you know, and want to go someplace. You know, we put ourselves everywhere, and I think that we are hardwired that way. I think, you know, one of the longest living things we do is tell ourselves stories. You know, parents tell their children stories, politicians tell stories, everybody tells stories, and you can just come up with something on the fly that fits your reality and world.
Yeah, I don't know. Just hearing this conversation makes me think. I mean, I think that one of the special things about comics and about drawing is, and this has just occurred to me as we talk here, is the social aspect of it. I mean, I remember being a kid, watching other kids draw, watching my dad draw, and that there's something about comics that is very personal in the sense that somebody drew this thing, you know, and it came off of somebody's hand. Movies are totally immersive, you know. I mean, you see a movie and it's like, it feels like reality, you know what I'm saying? And even though it's all crafted, it feels like something real, and you just are in it, and you just kind of accept it as reality. Comics have a little bit of a story behind the story, because it's a representation of reality, and you know it's a representation of reality, but it is, but that's kind of what draws you into it, because there's this, you know, whether you're conscious of it or not, there's this, you're aware of this. You know, on some level, I think we're aware of this human hand behind these drawings, and that's something, again, that's something primal. You know what I mean? That's something intimate about somebody trying to show you something. So I think that's, I don't know why that occurred to me. I think just talking about Cave. I saw that Cave of Forgotten Dreams, that Herzog movie too, which is, it may still be showing. It's really great. But that, I think there is something about comics that's special because it is so, yeah, because it comes from a human hand, you know.
The author controls it so much. Yeah. I think also because the author controls it so much. It's not like a prose book where you are creating that environment. Even though they'll say to you, this took place in a room, you have to supply that with your imagination, whereas the comics author, it gives you this visualization, but it's still vague enough where, unlike a film where, you know, which is so specific and so detailed and creates a reality, the comics author is like sort of behind you in a way, and you're sort of interpreting his work at the same time.
You know, there's one other kind of really special thing about comics too, is that they're still, but they convey such a sense of motion. You know what I mean? And that's the miracle of comics, and I think that's also something that's special. But like again, in a movie, you're just immersed in it, and it just happens around you, and you're not even aware of what's happening. You're just in this other world. But in comics, you are. I mean, you look at any of these images up on the wall, and they all have your eye goes through them a certain way because of the way they're laid out. I mean, there's motion that you're participating in that, and you are making that motion, and you're being led through that motion. As Christine was saying, by the there's something very interactive about that. That is really kind of a special thing. In a weird way, I mean, in that way, it's like it's the most. Universal kind of thing. Everybody like draws little pictures to help explain something. You know what I mean? It's the most universal kind of communication. But then it also becomes this. This is a random thing, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of. I think about improv comedy, where I did improv comedy for years, and one of the funny things about improv comedy is that one of the great pleasures of it is awareness of the artificiality of it. You know what I mean? That you're watching people up on stage and they are becoming other people on the fly or plunging into other situations on the fly, and you're drawn into it because of the excitement of the change in the moment, because you're watching the storytelling as it's happening, and you're part of that, and you're kind of identifying with these individuals who are up on stage. You may at the same time be lost in them, as you may be immersed in whatever characters they're creating, but a big part of the joy is watching these individuals who are real people becoming other things. Do you know what I mean? And I think comics shares in that in a kind of fun way.
Only a half suspension of disbelief. It's instead of like completely losing yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a kid I was obsessed with Michael Golden, who's one of the who drew the NAM for Larry back in the day. He drew the Micronauts. I remember having a very serious conversation with one of my grade school. Here's somebody else who's a big Golden fan. who Yeah, there you go. The only Batman comic I ever bought back in the day was this one that Michael Golden guest penciled with Catman. But I remember having a very serious conversation with a teacher talking about, seriously arguing that Michael Golden was on par with Michelangelo. But there was something about the way, again, there's something about that personal hand working miracles in just using these lines to create motion. So anyway, I'm talking too much.
I mean, I guess, as it pertains to Asian writing, things like that, anybody here take calligraphy classes, like learn how to, anybody? Not many. I did for about 8 years, and, learn how to use a brush, had to rub your own ink, do the whole nine, very hands-on tactile sensations. But for the longest time, I had trouble, remembering how to write kanjis and certain kind of characters and combinations, because I was thinking of it mathematically, and it was at the point where maybe because my dad was an artist, he decided to introduce the concept that these are pictures, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And it's like, well, you see the river? It's got 3 lines and kind of like wavy, and suddenly I'm looking at it, and it was like a light bulb went off, and we started doing these drills where he would draw the character, tell me what it was, and say, okay, now. Make this, it's a little abstract symbol, symbolically, make it a river. And so I would then continue the lines and draw this whole picture around it. And it just burned into my head all, how similar, how literal a lot of these symbols are to the actual things. And to this day, I deconstruct things and, just kind of figure out, in some ways, meaning through just the way it looks. It definitely made, calligraphy class a lot more fun. But, I had to stop short of drawing, and actually remember these are characters, there's certain rules, certain brushstrokes. But, in terms of how that, how maybe Asian culture in general, Eastern culture, embraces comics and just kind of pictorial art form, I don't know, maybe there is something to that. It's just, it's more accepted. But then again, you go to Europe, and Europeans love comics too, and I guess they didn't go to calligraphy class, but so there goes my theory.
Mine too.
The nice thing about being on the end of the panel is that everybody before you makes all the talking points far more articulately and persuasively than I can. I mean, that's pretty much covered it all. I will just touch a little bit on what Larry said initially, that I really do think it is a very multicultural way of communicating and telling stories, in the sense that it's just because of how we are geared or programmed to recognize visual things and to automatically attach or connections and relationships between objects and form our own story in our mind. Regardless of whether or not you understand the language. I mean, in my situation, like I mentioned earlier, like an enormous part of my influence is European comics, which Tack just mentioned, and mostly French comics, or bande dessinée. And for any French speakers in the room, I'm sorry for butchering that pronunciation. So, I mean, I have tons and tons and tons of French books, but you know something? I don't read a lick of French. You know, so, but that doesn't take away from how much I value them, because it is just at that point enjoying them for the storytelling and the narrative. And even though I don't understand a single word any of the characters are saying, still having a very personal connection to the work, to the good work. I mean, of course, just like any other culture, there's a lot of bad stuff out there too, and you know, you try not to get that in your head too much, but. It's just still being able to connect with the author or the illustrator, like Greg was saying, like how they're actually drawing the line and feeling the work that was put into it, regardless of whether or not you understand the language that it's being written in. And I think that's really just one of the great aspects of comics in general, or telling stories with comics in general, is that it lives between. Basically, comics is where images or film and writing collide, right? Like it's instead of writing something in pure prose, you can add images to it to you know, build a world better, or to make it more material for the reader. And on the flip side, unlike film, there's no motion, there's no like movement attached to it, in the sense of literally like time going by. I mean, not the implied motion, which I totally agree with what Greg was saying, the best comics do that, but I meant more specifically like when you go see a movie, you're seeing it exactly timed the way you're supposed to see it, you know, whether it's a scene that takes 5 minutes or it takes 5 seconds. But with comics, I think the fact that that aspect of it is removed from the equation, and that you can read a page, a panel, a chapter, a book at whatever speed you want, allows for that personal connection to form, to be deeper, because it makes it a more of a unique experience for each individual reader, depending on how quickly or slowly they're reading it, or how quickly or slowly they're processing every word balloon or every panel or every page. So.
A lot of what you guys have been saying actually leads up to the second question I want to address before we, you know, throw things out to you guys to ask some questions. I'm actually going to turn it back to a Facebook status update that Larry made that really kind of caught my eye and ended up, I think, getting hundreds of comments. It was just really sort of a stray thought, but really expressed in a lot of ways the uniqueness of comics beyond simply the fact that it's an image plus words form. It's also a form that embeds within it conventions and metaphors that, in many ways, are what make the form itself something special, something that actually does come to life beyond simply, say, a triptych of images. The status update, I don't know if you remember it, was one where you were wondering what happened to, what are they called, spider legs or something? These particular, you know, roach legs, right. So I'll let Larry explain this, but you know, all of you guys who have read cartoons or watched, you know, read cartoons or comic books growing up know that within comic books there are certain sort of gestures, certain strokes, certain, you know, lines that mean certain things. And as you actually read comics, you pick up the fact that these things mean something more. This is motion. This is dizziness. This is you know, various kinds of iteration of expression that go beyond simply image plus text and transform into something more and richer and deeper, a metaphoric space, which I think works really well, especially in the new technologies we're going to be discussing. So Larry, what was this roach legs thing?
Well, let me explain. What roach legs is what we used to call the 3 lines on either side of an onomatopoeic expression, like ahem, or gasp, you know, or ulp, there would be these 3 lines that would sort of like burst out from the word. And, you know, most people didn't need to be told any of these things. You figured it out from the context. But, you know, there's an entire vocabulary of these sort of symbols and conventions that, you know, we all know here in America, that, you know, people, it might not be familiar to in other cultures, you know, and there's all these conventions about, you know, shortcuts for expression or whatever that aren't totally universal. You know, when manga and anime first started coming in here, you know, American readers would like look at this stuff and go like, why is this guy sweating all the time? Or, you know, they didn't understand that, like, you know, in a Jap, you know, like in Dr. Slump, you know, like a character would, like, his eyes would bulge out and all the sweat would pop out of his head. Well, you know, that's, you know, in Japan, that means that's a symbol for sexual excitement, you know, but, like, you know, nobody here could grasp that, you know. And what, you know, GB was saying about, you know, the time perception, I think is very relevant right now, because, you know, before there were video recorders and DVDs and a stop and a replay button, you were stuck with one way to see a film, you know, the way the director planned it. You just had to watch the whole thing through. You know, but now, you know, with changes in technology and medium, you know, people go back and play the same scene back, you know, over and over, you know, 30 times because they like it. Well, you know, in a comic book, you can do that too. You go back and like stare at that same panel for 5 minutes. You know, but you know, the way we've been taught to perceive comics and use them and utilize them, that methodology has now migrated into how we look at films. You know, people now, you know, if you're under, you know, 25, your concept of watching a movie is not, oh, I got to just like sit here and let it play. You know, you've got all these other choices. You've got, you know, the extra added disc, you know, with, you know, the scenes that were taken out, and it's affected the way we perceive all these things, especially as theater attendance drops off and more people are like looking at the stuff on media, you know, and I think that's an important part of how all this stuff changes and evolves.
The only thing I came up with is a friend of mine actually, and we're talking about these type of symbols or gestures in comics that don't occur in real life, and we tried to come up with a big long list of them, and one of them was like the gesture for like when somebody's broke, you know, and you open your wallet and a moth flies out. And we're just like, that doesn't actually happen. Like, how did, you know, these sort of strange things come up, or a giant exclamation point behind your head, or, you know, I just
Half your face covered with a Spider-Man outfit.
Right.
Spider-Man mask.
It's kind of nutty.
I think.
Or just, you know, how you know, like the
Spider
lines
sense.
radiating from your head.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
it's like,
I remember the first comic book I ever had, actually, or one of the only one, the earliest comic book that I read that I still own is this big giant Marvel Treasury Edition Spider-Man, which reprinted, I think, the first issue of the first appearance of the Green Goblin. But they had a little section in there which was about, like, you know, like, here's why we do stuff. And it was really eye-opening for me as a 7-year-old or whatever reading this, where they were describing that exact moment where, you know, they show Spidey having, you know, his spider sense, and they say, we put these squiggles there just to kind of, you know, juice it up, you know, so you know what's going on, even though they don't make any sense, but they do, you know. It was very fun kind of having that Stan Lee kind of, it just works kind of, you know, explanation of it. It just works.
well, yeah, and we're stuck with these things that, you know, once they get into popular culture, they never leave. You know, it's like, when was the last time you actually saw a real clothespin? You know, but like they're always on people's noses when they,
Or a rolling pin being held by an angry wife. Like that's.
Well, you know, I mean, some of these things that we actually look at and see as kind of cliches or conventions, they're such a huge part in a lot of ways of our popular culture and our rendition of culture. Even if they're things that are anachronistic at this point or very sort of specific to our culture, what they represent is a kind of avatarization of reality that opens up the full field of the medium when you actually take it into the digital space. What I mean by that is, you know, this is something which I was reflecting from the very moment that Larry kind of first started discussing this, the ideas around this panel. You know, we really are in a world where comic book reality has become reality, period. Like, the way that we interact with our computers, with our cell phones, there are so many different things. Even the metaphor, an iPhone, for instance, the way that an iPhone works, you know, the fact that when you actually, you know, swipe something and come to the end of it, it sort of bounces a little bit and then sort of swings back, you know? That physical reality doesn't happen in real life, but it happens in the comics. You know, when you run into a wall, usually you would crash and fall down and be hurt. But in the comics, you bounce off, and there's like squiggle lines, and you know. So the physics of the comics, the iconography of comics, the metaphors of comics have become part of the way that a generation of people are growing up experiencing the world. And a lot of that is tied to culture, as we've discussed, but a lot of it is also universal. It's humanistic and not just you know, not just expressed in a single cultural perspective. And I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a couple years ago I was approached to do like an animation for Secret Asian Man, just, you know, produce it as a short, you know, either, it was kind of more of a brainstorming. Well, what would this be? Web series, short series, feature, you know, pitch to Fox, that kind of thing. And, you know, I found the hardest thing that I was struggling with was breaking that comics convention. I'm used to having empty spaces in a frame. Like when I draw things, there's always an empty space in the frame for words, right? So it's hard for me to actually, you know, push the people up. One of the things I struggled with the most was a voice. Like suddenly these people that I had, you know, all the voices in my head while I was reading them, they had individual voices. Suddenly they needed a voice that came out of this box. And that was really weird. And, you know, the timing and, you know, even listening to yourself on a message, you sound horrible to yourself, right? So like, you know, me voicing my own character was just, nah, you know, like I don't want to do that, even though it's supposed to be me. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely lots of, you know, those kind of things that are unique to comics. And it's definitely a challenge kind of, you know, thinking a lot. And, you know, I definitely think a lot about digital world and, you know, things beyond motion graphics, which, you know, really annoy me to some extent. They take a comic book, cut it up, and then they move it. You know, and it's like, ooh, you know, and it's kind of like actually the old Marvel animations, like the Captain Americas and the Hulks they used to do, which is basically like, you know, the Hulk on a popsicle stick going over a camera. You know, and it was, you know, it was, but who cares? It was magic. You know, you're like 6 years old and you're just watching this, like, the Hulk just jumped over a building. So, you know, like, it kind of doesn't matter, but, you know, at the same time, there's got to be something, and I think part of digital isn't just purely aesthetic now. It's an experience. It's experiential, and you know, and it's tough because in a way you still want to tell a story. You don't want to just have it be a reality in a little tablet. You know, you kind of want to have a beginning and an end. So you don't want people to just wander aimlessly, like, ooh, where does this door, you know, interactive door go? What is this Easter egg? And suddenly you completely lose what the story is. So it's got to be a good marriage of the two. Otherwise, you know, it kind of doesn't work. It becomes watching a DVD and stopping at every, you know, commentary and being like, oh, George Lucas thought this. Like, shut up, I'm watching a movie.
I think it's, you know, if it's sort of comic book panels are like, you know, the frozen moments in kabuki. You know, I mean, there's an art form where they decided, well, this moment is so good, we should just prolong it. You know? And it's like, wow, everybody's been waiting for this moment to happen. You know, this is the climax of these events. You know, let's just have the guys, you know, reach that climactic moment and hold it.
Well,
and so everybody can like really dig it for a long time.
That's an action movie convention now. That's the
Right.
300, the guy leaping through the air, and he hits that perfect frame, and they just hold it. You know, they slightly move it a little bit as they go, you know.
I was thinking the end of the airplane movies where they would be pouring coffee and then keep pouring and overflowing while the credits were things are burning. They're like, we can't move.
Well, yeah, just to touch on that a little bit. I mean, a conversation about where comics are going to go with the digital as digital interfaces evolve is like, that's a conversation for another day, not like in a 1 hour panel for sure. But I just want to say, like, I definitely do, at the very least, it will profoundly change storytelling, I think, just because the sense that what you guys were talking about, how there are like these comic shorthand to depict things for the reader, regardless of your life experiences or what language you speak that you understand, like, you know, squiggly lines is expressive or whatever like that. But with as technology evolve, I mean, simple things of like, okay, well, you used to be able to show a person when they were talking on the phone holding a phone. Now you show someone holding a little rectangle. Like, what is, I mean, when you look at it, okay, are they holding an iPhone? Like, are they holding, you know, it becomes a more, you know, abstract object, and suddenly it doesn't translate so quickly to the reader. Or like, you know, when you had, if you wanted to show a character that was learning some kind of, you know, event that happened in the news, and they were reading a newspaper or something in a panel, and you could show on the newspaper that, you know, some hints or clues of what was happening, but now you show a character reading an iPad. Like, okay, well, what are they reading on the iPad? You know, so I think in that sense, I do really think as technology continues to evolve and it seems along this track to being more minimal as far as the interface with the user, like that's gonna deeply, deeply profound, like how we tell stories, like the images we use and how we use, you know, the connections that we make and how we relay them to the reader, for sure.
That's fascinating, because like every cliche could just basically be replaced with an iPhone. It's like you'd be angry woman chasing somebody with an iPhone, and like a little moth flying out of an iPhone.
Sweating iPhones when you're sexually aroused.
So, you know, that's where we have gotten to at this point. We've talked about the kind of cultural context, the history, and the edge of what's next, the edge of the possible. And you know how the metaphors of comics are maybe in some ways bridging that gap between now and the next. And now we want to open it up to questions from you guys. I think we have probably time for a couple. Is that right, Alex? Okay. So let's start over here.
Larry, you didn't say precisely what was in your Facebook post. What?
Oh, the Facebook post.
Yeah, what was the fight? I mean, you went on about it, but you know, what was precisely in your Facebook post?
I think it was just as simple as, like, whatever happened to roach legs? I mean, that was, yeah. Because, you know, roach legs were a peculiar holdover. They were peculiar to hand lettering, you know. And when they switched over to Photoshop, to you know, digital fonts for lettering, somehow a lot of fonts didn't include the roach legs. You know,
Option E or whatever it was. Option roach leg.
yeah. I mean, who else here uses them?
I think we used them in Hercules. We did a lot of crazy things with sound effects in Hercules. I think we.
You know how people do air quotes when they're being sarcastic, you know, sort of like sarcastically. Now I want to, like, every time I do, you know, an expression, I want to go like this and just gasp. Oh my God. Question?
Thanks very much. The question I had is about the pioneering forms of Asian characters that have been showing up in the history of comic books here in America. What I'm sort of interested to ask is, in your estimation, all of you at the table, do you see sort of stealth forms of Asian type characters that showed up? So not Chop Chop, but let me give an example. Snake Eyes, who to me always felt like, no pun intended, a secret Asian man, right? And that's the way I read him for all of those issues up until the Revelation issue, which is up there on the wall, on the yellow wall over there. And there we see that he's an American man with blonde hair. Certainly we knew that, but the way he physically appeared, the fact that if there ever was a word bubble, it had something that looked like roach legs in it, and he'd be whispering to Scarlet. He felt to me like an Asian character, and I glommed onto that. And, you know, I'm an Indian kid, and still, there was a space there for me to want to attach to this character and think, this guy is kick-ass, And of course, then I wanted to buy the action figure. So I'm just curious to ask, that's one example that had a potency for me. But I'm curious to just ask if you guys sense other examples in the history of American comics. And in the case of Snake Eyes, was there a resistance to oppose giving that origin story? Because until then, he was a very imaginal character. There was such powerful unknowns to him that gave us so much space to think about him in different ways.
Well, you have to realize that the reason that, I didn't have a lot of restrictions on writing G.I. Joe, mainly because nobody cared. You have to understand that in the early 1980s, there hadn't been a toy book that lasted more than 2 or 3 years. Maybe there hadn't even been one that lasted a year. They were disposable things. Nobody wanted to work on them because they had to pay the licensing fees first, and so all the rates were lower. So, anybody who was a top earning artist didn't want to work on a franchise book or a licensing book. Also, in the toy industry, which had been burnt by what were those terrible, ugly dolls that the Cabbage Patch dolls. I mean, the Cabbage Patch dolls to the toy industry was like cholera or something. It was, they were selling so incredibly. Everybody, they were paying like hundreds of dollars for these things at Christmas, and they thought, wow, we've hit this is the next Grail or something. And there were hundreds of warehouses full of these things, and overnight, nobody wanted them anymore. And this created such a fear in the toy industry that, the given was that, a toy line lasts 2 years. And after that, you gotta bail out, as fast as you can. So after the first, 2 years of G.I. Joe, they said, okay, we're gonna bail out on this, But then they started looking at the sales, and they said, oh no, maybe we'll stick around another year. And 10 years later, it was still running. But nobody knew that was going to happen. So in the beginning there, the first bunch of years, nobody cared what I did. I could just do anything, and my stealth Asian character was an Asian character, a Storm Shadow. Who was okay. They created this figure that was an Asian character, but he was a bad guy. So the way I dealt with it was like, well, even the guys on the other side have to have personalities. Ethically and morally, I felt that if you do a comic about soldiers and about conflict and war, that you can't demonize the enemy, that you have to show that they are people, and what the results of this conflict are, and what the results of the chain of revenge is. And that was always the main theme, was how to break out of the cycle of revenge and break out of the cycle of solving problems like that. And boy, I've completely lost my thread. But this is the way I write a comic anyway. It's like I have no idea what's going to happen on page 22 until I get to page 21. And and to me, everything is a retcon. Other people, like a lot of people don't agree with me on this. But this is the only way I know how to do it. I don't care at all about the plot. All I care about is the characters and making them stand up and making making them walk around and be real. And I believe that's the only reason why people come back to read that stuff is you want to spend time with those characters, you know. The average reader isn't sitting there parsing the plot, you know. I mean, one of the big problems in Hollywood is that, you know, the first stage of judging a script is it's given to some, you know, kid who's fresh out of film school, you know, and who's 22 years old, and that's the first line of filtration, you know, a reader, you know, and they parse that script according to like a sheet that they've been given that says, you know, number 1, does it have 3 acts? Number 2, you know, can you follow the character arcs? Number 3, it's all this stuff about the mechanics of the plot. And nowhere on that sheet does it say, gee, do you like these people? Or, hey, do you give a shit what happens to these people? You know, and if you forget those 2 things, you've forgotten everything, you know. But, you know, to actually answer your question, yes, I've dealt with that through stealth stuff, and I've done that. I also did that with. I tried to do that with female characters. You know, I created, you know, the Baroness character because, you know, they had all these characters in Cobra who had no faces, you know, like completely faceless. And I said, well, how do you have you know, dramaturgy, you know, with no agents of expression, you know? So I had to have somebody who could like go, you know, or like go, huh? You know, you know, be able to express something through their facial features in order to be able to tell the story, you know, and I included female characters in the Joes for the same reason, and I said, you know, and I started getting letters from girls, which was very unusual. You know, they said, wow, you know, something like 15 or 20% of my letters to G.I. Joe were from girls. Then I realized much later that if a comic book goes into a household, every kid in that household reads that comic. So like, you know, if your brother buys the G.I. Joe, you probably read it, you know? I mean, as a kid, I read my cousin's copies of Little Lulu and Archie and all that stuff, you know? They were considered girl comics that, like, you know, boys wouldn't read. But, you know, they were sitting there, and I read them, you know? And the letters that I got from girls all said the same thing. They said, boy, you know, I started reading this, and I really like it because the girls aren't treated any different from the guys, you know. What? You know, and they don't walk around with their palms nailed to their forehead, you know.
They had guns.
You know, they do their job, right, and they're treated just the same, you know, and that was a sort of a very big change at the time, you know, and I also bucked the system by not having captions or thought balloons, which was anathema at the time. You know, Marvel Comics in the early 80s, it was like a third of the page was captions, you know, and it was all captions describing what should have been told in the pictures. And I said, well, no, we have to make the artist draw what's supposed to be there, and that's going to tell the story. We can't make up for it with, you know, with narration. Anyway, that's.
I had a stealth Asian answer for that. In the comics that I read as a kid, Conan, of course, is Asian. And the Silver Surfer is obviously Asian. If you look at the Zenlavians, just the way John Buscema drew their eyes and everything, they're straight up Asian. Come on.
Come on, Superman is Asian. Let's get real here. Superman has dark hair. He's got glasses. He's like an illegal alien from some other planet. The technology advanced. You know, secretly, I think all of us, and part of the wonder of comics, superhero comics especially, is that behind the mask, you can imagine anybody. You can imagine yourself. And with that, I mean, we have to move on to the next stage of this. But I think that if there's anything that represents the next boundary of where comics is going, where all these guys are going, it's that the limitless wellspring of imagination is ultimately what comics allows you to play with, to work with. You're not limited by budget. You're not limited by anything except for ideas and a pen and the willingness to sit down and face a blank piece of paper for 3 hours or more. These guys are doing it. You guys can too. We'll all be hanging out here for a little while, so if you have additional questions, please feel free to talk and ask. And I think you guys are signing stuff back there afterwards, right?
Yep.
Like books and things.
Some free comics back there, too.
Free, and yes. And with that, I want
Just
to pass back.
Greg's.
Yeah. Back over to.
Join me in thanking this amazing.
Thanks, everyone.